You know how people always say that weddings bring out the best and the worst in families? I used to laugh when I heard that, thinking it was just one of those cliches people repeat when they have nothing better to say. But the day before my brother's wedding, when I casually said, "Can't wait for tomorrow," and saw the way my aunt froze like she had just seen a ghost, I realized that cliches sometimes exist for a reason. It all started in the middle of the living room, where half the family was gathered with suitcases and shopping bags scattered around. The fragrance of henna still lingering in the air from the women's Mendi night, and the faint clinking of glasses coming from the kitchen where the cousins were sneaking sodas and laughing too loud. I was standing near the window, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone and feeling that weird mix of excitement and exhaustion that comes before a wedding. I remember stretching my arms and looking around at the decorations, the fairy lights, blinking faintly, the chairs stacked up for tomorrow's ceremony. And without really thinking much about it, I muttered in a cheerful tone, "Can't wait for tomorrow." It was supposed to be a simple, harmless statement, something anyone would say on the eve of a wedding, right? But the moment the words slipped out of my mouth, I noticed a shift in the room. My aunt, the one everyone described as the most composed, the one who never lost her calm no matter how chaotic things got, suddenly went rigid. Her face lost all its warmth. Her hands froze mid-gesture as if she had been about to put her teacup down but forgot how to move. And for a brief moment, she just stared at me with wide eyes, her lips slightly parted. At first, I thought maybe she hadn't heard me properly, or maybe I had said it louder than I realized. But when I met her gaze, I felt this strange heaviness in the air. Like an invisible shadow had just entered the room and sat between us. My cousins were still laughing, the TV was still playing in the background. But none of that mattered because my aunt's reaction had created a silence so sharp it cut through all the noise. She didn't smile, didn't laugh, didn't even blink. And I could see her knuckles whitening as she clutched her teacup tighter. My first instinct was to laugh it off. So I said, "What? I'm just excited." But that didn't break her trance. Instead, she slowly put the cup down, placed her palms on her knees, and with a low, shaky voice said, "Don't ever say that again." And in that instant, I felt my stomach drop. It was such a bizarre, overdramatic response to such an ordinary statement that I didn't know how to react. Everyone else around us seemed oblivious, still caught up in their little conversations. But for me, the whole atmosphere had shifted. Her eyes had this haunted look, the kind that belongs to someone remembering something they wish they could. Forget I didn't know it yet, but what she was about to reveal would not only change the way I looked at weddings forever, but also drag a family secret out into the open that had been buried for decades, hidden under layers of silence, denial, and carefully crafted smiles. I thought I was just stepping into a festive weekend full of music, food, and laughter, but I was about to walk straight into a storm of old wounds and haunting truths. And it all started with those 4 careless words. "Can't wait for tomorrow." The moment my aunt whispered those words, "Don't ever say that again," something inside me twisted, as though I had just been scolded for committing an unforgivable sin without even realizing what it was. I tried to brush it off with a nervous laugh, glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed, but strangely, seemed like the world around us kept spinning, while I stood frozen in that little bubble of unease with her. The cousins were still debating about which playlist to use for the wedding entrance. My brother was joking with his friends on a video call. My mother was busy with a seamstress checking the final touches on the groom's sherwani. Yet here, I was suddenly trapped in this heavy silence with my aunt's piercing eyes locked on me. I lowered my voice, leaned closer, and asked, "Why? What's wrong with saying that?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she shook her head slowly. Her lips pressed tightly as if she was holding back something she didn't want to let slip. The longer she stayed silent, the more anxious I became. There was a tension in her posture, in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way her breath grew unsteady, like she was wrestling with a memory she didn't want to revisit. Finally, she whispered so low that I had to strain my ears, You don't know what those words mean in this family." That line alone made my heart skip a beat. What could possibly be wrong with expressing excitement for a wedding? Weddings are supposed to be filled with optimism, right? But the way she said it, as though it carried the weight of a curse, sent shivers down my spine. I tried to coax her, half curious, half afraid. "Auntie, please, you can't just say that and—" "Stop. What do you mean?" Her eyes flicked toward the rest of the family as if to check if anyone was listening, and then back to me. There was a kind of desperation in her glance, a pleading not to push further, but also an unspoken acknowledgement that the secret was clawing at the edges of her mind. She finally stood up abruptly, muttering, "Not here, not now," and walked toward the hallway. I hesitated for a moment before following her, my heart pounding louder than the music playing in the background. She led me into the guest room, closed the door behind us, and sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. I sat across from her, still not knowing whether I had done something terribly wrong or if she was overreacting. She took a deep breath and said, "Every time someone in this family has ever said those exact words before a wedding, something terrible happened the next day." My skin prickled with goosebumps, my rational mind wanting to dismiss it as superstition, but her voice carried such raw conviction that it was impossible not to feel unsettled. She went on, detailing how decades ago, when she was just a teenager, her cousin had whispered the same phrase on the night before his wedding, excited about finally starting a new chapter. But the next morning, he never made it to the altar. He had died in a car accident on his way to pick up relatives from the airport. Her eyes filled with tears as she recounted it, and I could tell this wasn't some distant family myth. She had lived through it. I opened my mouth to argue that coincidences happen, that people say those words all the time, but before I could, she added another story. Years later, one of my uncle's friends said those exact words the evening before his marriage ceremony. The following morning, a fire broke out at the wedding hall before the ceremony even began, leaving the groom injured and the entire event canceled. I swallowed hard, trying to stay skeptical, but the way her voice trembled, the way she held her own arms tightly as though trying to shield herself from old wounds, made it feel terrifyingly real. "It's like a curse," she whispered. "Those words, they invite disaster. And I've lived long enough to know not to ignore it." I stared at her, trying to process the weight of her confession, caught between disbelief and a strange fear I couldn't shake off. The logical part of me wanted to argue that life is full of accidents, that no string of coincidences should be mistaken for a pattern. Yet sitting there, with her pale face and haunted eyes reflecting years of silent dread, I couldn't shake the eerie thought. Had I just doomed my brother's wedding by saying something so ordinary? I remember sitting there staring at her like she had just told me the ending of a horror story I never signed up to hear, my pulse racing faster than my ability to reason. I wanted to say something comforting like, "It's just coincidence," or even laugh it off and tease her about being overly superstitious, but the look in her eyes wouldn't let me. They weren't the eyes of someone spinning a tale for drama. They were the eyes of someone who had lived with fear stitched into the fabric of her memory. The lines on her face deepened as she spoke, her hands twisting the edge of her dupatta, as though she needed to anchor herself in something tangible while revisiting ghosts from the past. "Do you think I wanted to believe in this?" she asked, her voice sharp but fragile at the same time. "Do you think I liked living with this dread?" I shook my head silently, because truthfully, I didn't know what to think. She told me that every time someone in the family innocently let those words slip, she would feel the same chill she had felt just now. A coldness that crept into her bones and made her stomach knot. "It's not just about bad luck," she whispered, leaning closer. "It feels like those words summon something." That last part sent a wave of unease rolling through me. Summon something? The phrase echoed in my mind, almost absurd, but terrifying because of the conviction in her tone. I tried to stay rational, telling myself that we live in a world of explanations. where accidents happen, tragedies occur, and sometimes patterns are only illusions created by coincidence. Yet, the way she described it, the way her voice quivered when she said summon, made me wonder if maybe families carry curses the same way they carry heirlooms passed silently from one generation to the next. Invisible, but heavy, I found myself fidgeting, my leg bouncing uncontrollably. Because no matter how much I wanted to dismiss her, a seed of doubt had already been planted. I thought back to the way she froze when I said it, the way the room suddenly felt colder, even though the heater was running, and I began to notice things I hadn't before. The flickering of the fairy lights outside the window now seemed eerie, instead of festive. The muffled laughter of cousins sounded distant, like echoes coming from another world. Even the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder, more insistent, like it was counting down to something inevitable. I asked her, almost afraid of the answer, "So, what do I do now?" I already said it. Her face paled further, and for a moment I thought she might break down crying, but she didn't. Instead, she inhaled deeply and said, "Now you pray. Pray harder than you've ever prayed before. And tomorrow, you stay vigilant." Those words made my stomach twist into knots, because suddenly this wasn't just about superstition anymore. It was about the possibility that my brother's big day, the day everyone had been planning for months, could unravel in a way nobody expected. I wanted to believe everything would be fine, that it was just nerves, but I couldn't ignore the way her voice cracked when she added, "I lost someone once because I didn't take it seriously." The room went silent after that, the kind of silence that feels like a wall pressing in on you. I didn't know what scared me more, the curse she believed in, or the fact that her belief was so strong it was now infecting me. I nodded slowly, promising her I would keep my mouth shut, though deep inside I wondered if words alone could truly hold so much power. Still, as I sat there watching the way her hands shook, even after she stopped speaking, I realized one thing. Tomorrow was no longer just my brother's wedding date, was a test of whether fate really listened when we spoke, and whether I had just triggered something none of us could control. That night felt heavier than any night I can remember. After my aunt's warning, I couldn't relax the way everyone else seemed to. My cousins were running around making TikToks in their wedding clothes. My brother was on FaceTime with his fiancée, and the elders were busy making last-minute arrangements, arguing over whether the seating should be shifted slightly to accommodate a few extra guests. Should have been a night of laughter, noise, and joyful chaos. But for me, every sound felt distant, like it was happening behind glass. While my mind replayed my aunt's trembling voice over and over, every time someone has said it, something terrible happened. I tried distracting myself by helping my mother pack the jewelry, but my hands kept shaking so badly that she snapped at me for being careless. I wanted to tell her everything, to explain why I looked so pale, but I stopped myself because how? Do you explain a superstition without sounding insane? Instead, I excused myself and stepped outside, hoping the cold air would calm me down. The night was unusually still, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every small sound, the crunch of gravel under your shoes, the rustle of dry leaves, the faint hum of a streetlight. I leaned against the railing, staring at the sky, and for the first time in years, I felt afraid of tomorrow. Weddings are supposed to be promises of beginnings, but now all I could picture were endings. My aunt's words had wormed their way into me, convincing me that I had accidentally invited something dark, something waiting in the shadows to strike just when joy was at its peak. I kept thinking of the accidents she mentioned, of the cousin who died, of the fire at the hall. And I couldn't shake the thought that maybe fate was cruel enough to repeat patterns if you weren't careful. When I finally went back inside, I found my aunt sitting in a corner alone, her face half hidden in the shadows. She looked up at me with weary eyes and whispered, "You feel it now, don't you?" And the terrifying truth was I did. The air itself felt heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or if something unseen was really hovering over us. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of disaster: a car crash, a fire, my brother collapsing in his wedding attire, and I jolted awake, drenched in sweat. When morning finally came, the house was a whirlwind of activity, with makeup artists arriving. The sound of doll beating outside, neighbors pouring in to help. But beneath all the noise, I could feel this strange undercurrent of dread gnawing at me. I caught my aunt watching me several times, her lips moving silently like she was praying under her breath. And each time our eyes met, I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that nothing bad was going to happen, that today would be like any other wedding day, filled with laughter, dancing, and happy tears. But the strange thing is, once fear enters you, it colors everything. The smiles seemed a little too forced, the laughter a little too sharp, the songs a little too loud. Like everyone was trying to drown out something lurking just beneath the surface. Even my brother, who was usually calm and confident, looked unusually restless, checking his watch every few minutes, tapping his fingers against the armrest, muttering about how he hoped everything would go smoothly. At one point, I almost told him what I had done, the words I had spoken, and the curse my aunt believed in, but then I stopped myself. How could I ruin his day with a superstition? How could I put that burden on him when all he wanted was to marry the girl he loved? So instead, I swallowed the fear and forced myself to smile, telling myself again and again that it was nothing but coincidence. Yet deep down, I couldn't silence the whisper in my mind, the echo of my aunt's voice repeating like a warning bell. Don't ever say that again. And as we piled into the decorated cars to head toward the wedding venue, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. I had this sinking feeling that I was about to find out. Whether curses were real or not, the morning of the wedding should have been perfect, but instead, it felt like a fragile glass vase balanced on the edge of a table. One wrong move, and everything would shatter. The house buzzed with energy, relatives moving in and out like a small army, the aroma of biryani and kebabs drifting in from the caterers outside, while laughter and music swirled together like smoke. To anyone else, it was pure joy, but for me, every smile looked like a mask hiding nerves. Every loud laugh sounded just a little too desperate. And every ticking second reminded me that the day I had can't waited for was here. Heavy with my aunt's whispered warnings, I tried to distract myself by staying busy tying my brother's turban, fetching forgotten items for my mother, running last-minute errands, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. My aunt hovered near me all morning, watching me with those worried eyes, silently clutching her tasbih beads as though each whispered prayer was the only thing keeping disaster at bay. I avoided her gaze, not wanting to add fuel to my growing fear, but her presence was a constant reminder of the words I had spoken. Words that now felt like an invisible chain dragging me closer to some unseen fate. When we finally left for the wedding hall, the cars were decorated with ribbons and flowers. My cousins leaned out of windows, waving at neighbors, and the beat of the doll made it feel like a parade. Everyone laughed and cheered, taking selfies, shouting jokes, and for a few moments, I almost managed to believe everything would be fine. But then, just as our convoy turned onto the main road, the lead car screeched to a halt. Tires screamed, horns blared, and my stomach dropped. Through the windshield, I saw a truck barreling across the intersection, missing the first car in our line by mere inches. For a split second, the world froze. Gasps filled the air. My aunt let out a choked cry, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. If the timing had been even slightly different, if our car had been just a little ahead, the truck would have plowed straight into us. The drivers exchanged angry shouts. Horns continued to blare. But eventually, traffic moved again, and everyone tried to laugh it off as a near miss. "Just a crazy driver," someone muttered. "Thank God nothing happened." Everyone forced Smiles. But when I looked at my aunt, she wasn't smiling. Her lips were pressed tight, her face pale, her eyes locked on me with the kind of look that screamed, "Do you see now?" By the time we reached the venue, my nerves were shredded. The hall was beautiful, draped in gold and white, with chandeliers glittering overhead and tables overflowing with flowers. Guests poured in, dressed in their finest clothes. Music filled the air, and for most people, the near accident on the road was already forgotten, brushed off as bad luck. But I couldn't forget. It felt like a warning shot, a shadow reminding me that the day wasn't safe yet. As my brother prepared backstage, laughing nervously with his friends, I found myself pacing, unable to sit still. Every flicker of the lights made me jump. Every loud noise made me flinch, and I kept scanning the crowd like I was expecting disaster to walk in at any moment. My aunt sat quietly at a corner table, her fingers never stopping on the beads, her lips moving in constant prayer, and the sight of her made my chest tighten with guilt. I had turned a joyous day into a silent countdown to doom. And no matter how much I tried, I couldn't undo what I had said. The ceremony began. The bride entered, music swelled, and for a brief moment the hall was filled with pure magic. My brother's eyes lit up when he saw her, the kind of look that makes you forget everything else, and the crowd melted into applause and cheers. For a while, I almost let myself relax. Maybe my aunt was wrong. Maybe the curse was nothing more than her fear wrapped in stories. Maybe love was strong enough to keep darkness away. But then, just as the vows were about to begin, the chandeliers above flickered violently, plunging the hall into sudden darkness. Gasps erupted, children screamed, and in the pitch-black chaos, I felt my breath hitch in my throat. Seconds later, the emergency lights kicked in, casting the room in an eerie red glow. People laughed nervously, brushing it off as a power cut, but I saw my aunt across the room, frozen, her eyes wide with terror, whispering prayers faster than ever. And in that moment, with the red glow washing over the gold and white decorations, I realized this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The red emergency lights bathed the hall in an eerie glow. And though people tried to laugh it off, something about that darkness lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. My brother and his bride exchanged nervous glances. The crowd murmured uneasily, and the event manager scrambled to get the chandeliers lit again. My aunt sat stiff as a statue, lips trembling as she whispered prayers, her beads moving so quickly through her fingers that they clicked like restless teeth. I tried to tell myself it was just an electrical fault, nothing more. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows had been waiting for this moment. The words I had spoken the day before echoed in my head with the weight of a curse can't wait for tomorrow. Now tomorrow was here, and disaster seemed to stalk every corner. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the hall flickered between light and darkness, until finally the chandeliers came back alive, flooding the room with brightness again. The crowd erupted into cheers, relieved laughter, filling the air, but I noticed that my aunt didn't cheer. Didn't laugh. She only pressed her face into her hands like someone who had just survived a close call. The ceremony went on, but the unease didn't leave me. Every word of the vows, every cheer from the guests, every beat of the music felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. And then, just as my brother reached to place the ring on his bride's finger, a loud crash echoed through the hall. Everyone turned in horror to see one of the massive decorative pillars at the back topple forward, smashing into the floor with such force that pieces of plaster flew across the carpet. Guests screamed and scattered, chairs tumbled, and for one horrifying second, I thought the entire structure was collapsing. But miraculously, it wasn't. The damage was contained to that one corner, and though people rushed to check if anyone had been hurt, somehow the space had been empty when it fell. Not a single person was injured. Relief spread quickly through the crowd, but my aunt clutched my wrist so tightly it hurt. "You see?" She hissed in a trembling voice. "You see what happens My chest tightened with guilt and fear. But as I looked at the wreckage, something inside me shifted. Yes, things had gone wrong, terribly wrong, but no one had died, no one was bleeding, no lives were lost. Maybe the curse wasn't about destruction itself. Maybe it was about fear, about planting dread so deep it consumed joy. The ceremony resumed shakily, people forcing smiles and laughter to cover their unease. And eventually the rings were exchanged. The couple declared married, and the crowd erupted in applause. My brother's smile was radiant, his bride glowing beside him. And in that moment, despite everything, love triumphed over the shadows. I watched my aunt, expecting her to remain grim, but instead, tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered something that sounded like gratitude. Later, when the chaos had quieted and the guests had settled into dinner, I sat with her at the corner table, and she finally told me the truth behind her fear. It wasn't just superstition, it was grief. Her cousin who had died, the groom, whose wedding had burned, the accidents she spoke of, they had all happened close together when she was young. To her, those words became a trigger, a reminder. A curse she carried because she couldn't bear to think tragedy could strike again. I froze, she admitted softly, because when you said it, I felt the past rushing back. I thought I was about to lose someone all over again. I looked at her then, really looked, and saw not just fear but years of unspoken sorrow that had turned into superstition. I held her hand and whispered, "Nothing happened today. He's married now. He's safe." She nodded slowly, still trembling, but for the first time that day, faint smile appeared on her face. As the night wound down, music played, people danced, and my brother and his new wife laughed together like nothing could touch them. The earlier scares became stories people would laugh about later. Remember when the lights went out? Remember that pillar crash? But for me, they were reminders of how fragile happiness can feel when fear lives in the shadows. I realized then that words have power, not because they summon curses, but because of the meaning we give them, the fears we attach to them, the weight of the memories they awaken. My aunt froze because my casual excitement had pulled her back into decades of pain she had never healed from. In the end, nothing catastrophic happened. My brother got married, the family celebrated, and life moved forward. But I learned something important. Sometimes the ghosts we fear aren't in the future, they're buried in the past, waiting for a single careless word to bring them back. And now, every time I catch myself about to say, "Can't wait for it," tomorrow, I pause, remembering that night, my aunt's frozen face, and the truth that words can carry the weight of history.